What if the past is not as sealed as we imagine? What if time is not a straight road behind us, but a wide ocean, moving, folding, carrying strange currents we don't fully understand? Most of us live as if the future is untouched, as if tomorrow is a clean page. But every so often, a story surfaces that makes that certainty feel thinner. A report, a photograph, a name that appears from nowhere and then disappears again. Not proof, not prophecy, just a crack in the familiar shape of reality. In the early years of the 21st century, in a world still learning how to live online, a man walked into a federal office in Toronto and calmly surrendered himself. He wasn't running, he wasn't pleading, he was almost polite. His name, he said, was Andrew Carlson, and what had drawn attention to him was not violence, not espionage, not anything you'd expect from a man stepping into the arms of the government. It was money. In 2 weeks, Carlson had turned a modest investment into hundreds of millions of dollars through a series of stock trades so perfect they bordered on the impossible. Every rise anticipated, every collapse avoided, every gamble timed with unnatural precision. To investigators, it looked like insider trading on a scale never seen before. To Carlson, it was something else entirely. He told them he was not from 2003. He claimed he had come from the year 2256. At first, it sounded like desperation dressed as science fiction, a story invented to escape prosecution. But Carlson did not sound frantic. He did not sound unstable. He sounded certain. And then he offered something no ordinary fraudster would dare: predictions. He spoke of wars unfolding differently than the headlines promised, of disasters that would arrive with the cruelty of nature, indifferent to human preparation, of technologies still trapped in laboratories that would soon sit in the palms of billions. He described a world of glass screens and wireless voices, of cars that hummed without gasoline, of entire lives shared publicly across invisible networks. Engineers listening later would admit something unsettling. His details were not poetic guesses. They were technically coherent. And then, as quietly as he had appeared, Andrew Carlson vanished. No trial, no record. Bank accounts emptied into routes that led nowhere. A name that didn't exist before and did not exist after. The official explanation was simple: a criminal fled. But stories like this do not linger because they are simple. They linger because they sit at the edge of a question we cannot stop asking. If someone truly stepped out of tomorrow into today, would we recognize it? Or would we file it away as impossible because the alternative is too large to hold? Carlson's tale is only one thread in a much wider tapestry. Rumors and testimonies scattered across decades, across continents, across the fragile boundary between what we know and what we assume. A laboratory in Liverpool, where strangers appeared for 7 minutes and left behind diagrams too advanced for their era. A businessman in Tokyo carrying a passport from a country that never existed. A woman caught on film in 1917, walking through a crowd with something pressed to her ear, speaking as if the future were already in her hand. These are not stories of certainty. They are stories of tension, between memory and evidence, between wonder and skepticism, between the human hunger to believe in something more and the equally human need to keep the world understandable. Perhaps time travel is not real. Perhaps these are myths, shaped by coincidence, misunderstanding, or longing. Or perhaps the universe is stranger than our instincts allow, and the past, like the future, is not a locked room, only a door we have not learned how to open. This journey is not about proving the impossible. It is about sitting with the mystery, about listening to the echoes. Because sometimes the most haunting stories are not the ones that tell us time can be broken, but the ones that remind us how little we truly know about the shape of existence. And if time is not as solid as we think, then what else have we mistaken for permanence? That question is where our story begins. It started with a hum, a low vibration, pulsing like a heartbeat through the cold stone of the laboratory floor. November 8th, 1932, the University of Liverpool. Margaret Foster, a laboratory assistant, was alone late that evening, preparing equipment for an experiment scheduled the next day. The air smelled faintly of ozone. The electromagnetic field generators had been tested dozens of times before, harmless, routine, almost dull. And then something shifted. She would later write in her private journal that the room didn't simply fill, it changed. The air grew heavy, light bent strangely. And then, without warning, they appeared. Men and women. Out of place, out of time. Their clothing was like nothing she'd seen, cut perfectly, made from fabric that shimmered without sheen. Their shoes seamless, their expressions caught somewhere between panic and wonder. They looked around not as strangers in a foreign place, but like travelers returning to something half-remembered. They spoke English, but their words felt off, as if the language had twisted just slightly over the decades. One of them, a woman with dark eyes and clipped speech, stepped forward. Her name, she said, was Dr. Sarah Chen, a temporal physicist from the year 2089. They hadn't meant to come. Something had gone wrong. Two temporal fields, one from Foster's experiment, another from their own, had intersected. For just a few minutes, time had folded inward. The present met the future. Dr. Chen sketched modifications to the electromagnetic coils with breathless urgency. Her hands moved like someone transcribing music too fast for the ear. The diagrams were beyond Foster's understanding, and yet elegant in their form. Perfect arcs, loops, notations. Then, just as suddenly as they had arrived, the visitors began to fade. Their outlines blurred, their voices softened like distant echoes. Within moments, the lab was empty again. Silence. When Dr. Robert Nelson returned the next morning, Foster showed him everything. The notes, the diagrams, the story. His response was immediate: suppression. The notes were seized, the experiment cancelled, the lab shut down. Foster was told to forget, but she didn't. She hid copies of the diagrams in her belongings, and she wrote in secret a detailed account of those 7 minutes that altered her world. She never shared it publicly, not in her lifetime. Her daughter found the diary after Margaret's death in 1987. Decades later, engineers reviewed the diagrams. The physics embedded in those sketches described principles unknown in 1932, principles that would only be fully explored nearly a century later. Designs for field stabilization, resonance containment, concepts too advanced for their time, too precise to be accident. No official record of the experiment remains. No academic paper. No archived correspondence. The lab was demolished in 1934. Nelson quietly transferred to another university and never published again on electromagnetic theory. But Foster's diary remains, a solitary document, ink fading but defiant. It poses a question that science has yet to answer. If the future reached back, only for a moment, what would it look like? Would we recognize it? Would we fear it? Or would we, like Margaret Foster, carry its memory quietly through the rest of our lives, waiting for the world to catch up? What if time isn't a one-way street? What if it's a conversation, and we've only just begun to hear the reply? Tokyo, 1954. A humid summer afternoon at Haneda Airport. The terminal buzzed with the usual rhythms of travel: footsteps, boarding calls, the rustle of foreign newspapers. And then a man stepped forward, well-dressed, calm, confident. His passport, handed over to customs without hesitation, was the first red flag. It looked official: high-quality paper, watermarked, stamped with the insignia of a European country. Only one problem: that country didn't exist. The document listed Torod as the issuing nation, a place no official in Japan or the world recognized. Between France and Spain, he insisted. Near the Pyrenees, a sovereign nation for nearly 1,000 years. The customs officer, confused but composed, asked for clarification. The man pulled out a map. On it, the territory known as Andorra was labeled Tord, not crudely scribbled in, but printed, embedded. A map, he explained, that he'd used on dozens of previous trips. He spoke several languages fluently, carried currency from his supposed homeland, business cards, a driver's license, everything consistent, everything except the reality around him. He wasn't trying to deceive, that was clear. He was trying to understand why no one recognized the place he called home. Authorities detained him for questioning. Hours passed. He remained cooperative, though visibly rattled. His story never wavered. He had flown to Japan several times before, stayed at the same hotel, attended regular business meetings. Nothing had changed, until now. The hotel confirmed his story. Staff remembered him. Meeting logs from Tokyo-based companies matched his timeline. And yet, every record connected to Torred dissolved into contradiction. Colleagues swore his company was based in France. Others recalled Andorra. Still others didn't remember where it was based at all. Their memories frayed at the edges, like dreams slipping out of reach. That night, he was placed under watch in a locked hotel room. In the morning, he was gone. No sign of forced exit, no open window, no disturbance. Just gone. When investigators checked the evidence room, the man's documents had vanished. The passport, the license, the currency, even the photos taken for the report were missing. Only the initial customs records remained, bare traces of an encounter with someone who might not have belonged here at all. Security footage showed the man clearly, up until the camera tried to zoom in on his documents. The image blurred, glitched, as if the lens refused to focus on something that wasn't supposed to exist. It's easy to dismiss such stories. Administrative error, delusion, coincidence. But the witnesses remained adamant. They remembered what they saw: a traveler from a parallel path, a place real to him but lost to us. Geography, after all, is not just about land. It's about how we map our reality. And if there are infinite variations of Earth, each shaped by tiny shifts in history, then perhaps some travelers slip between them. Accidental immigrants from worlds just one heartbeat different. The man from Torrid never returned, but the echo of his presence remains, a reminder that borders may be more than lines on a map. They may be lines between timelines, and somewhere, in a version of the world that almost was, someone is wondering what happened to their colleague who never came back from Tokyo. Maybe he simply got on the wrong flight, or maybe the world around him changed and left him behind. It was just a crowd, smiling faces gathered beneath the marquee of a Hollywood theater. October 21st, 1928. The premiere of Charlie Chaplin's The Circus at Grauman's Chinese Theatre. A scene captured on film for publicity, forgotten for decades in studio archives. Until someone looked closer. In 2010, filmmaker George Clark was reviewing restored footage from the event. Grainy, silent, flickering images of people arriving, laughing, waving to the camera. Nothing unusual. Then he noticed her. A woman, walking alone. Dressed in dark clothes appropriate for the era. A hat pulled low. Her hand raised to her ear. Lips moving. She was speaking. But not to anyone around her. She was speaking into a small, rectangular object she held against the side of her head. And she wasn't just pretending. Her expressions shifted, as if responding in conversation. Her mouth moved in pauses and patterns that felt familiar. It was unmistakable. She was on a phone call. Frame by frame, Clark enhanced the footage. Her gestures, the way she held the object, the way she listened, then replied. Distracted, yet purposeful, just like someone talking on a cell phone while walking through a crowd. But this was 1928. There were no cell phones, no satellites, no digital networks. The first mobile phones wouldn't be tested for decades, and even then, they were bulky, crude, nothing like the sleek object she carried. Skeptics offered explanations. A hearing aid? A novelty device? Perhaps a prop? But acoustic analysis revealed she was clearly speaking, not just listening. And her timing matched the natural rhythm of two-way speech. Experts reviewed the original film reel. No evidence of tampering. The footage was genuine. Stranger still, her shoes, period appropriate at first glance, but when zoomed in, revealed a construction technique unknown at the time. Precise stitching, modern materials, a durability inconsistent with the era. Even her handbag, barely visible in the frame, had hardware not invented until decades later. Yet no one around her noticed. No stares, no laughter, no confusion. The crowd flowed around her as if she belonged. But she didn't. Studio records had no mention of her. Guest lists didn't include her name. Photographs of the event offered no match. It was as if she had stepped into that moment from somewhere else, recorded briefly by a camera that couldn't possibly understand what it had captured. A woman lost in time. But why here? Why this event? Was it intentional? A curiosity? A glitch? A misstep in a journey through decades? And if someone was capable of moving through time, would they walk among us like this? Quietly? Anonymously? Leaving only the smallest trace? The footage remains. Public. Unexplained. An ordinary woman doing something extraordinary at a moment that should have made it impossible. Perhaps she was no more than a visitor, or perhaps she was a witness, gathering a fragment of history firsthand. We often think time travelers would arrive in thunder and spectacle, but maybe, like her, they slip through unnoticed, blending into the crowd, caught only when we look back. And even then, only if we know what we're looking for. A single frame, a familiar gesture, a conversation held too early, in a world not yet ready to hear it. December 1944, deep in the forests of Poland, beneath the ruined shells of the Wenceslas mine, the war was nearing its crescendo. Allied forces were closing in, but underground, something else entirely was happening. They called it Die Glocke, the bell, 9 feet wide, 12 feet high, metallic, humming, and filled with a strange violet fluid the Nazi scientists named Serum 525, a substance unlike anything known at the time. Its glow wasn't just eerie, it was unnatural. The device spun in 2 counter-rotating cylinders, and when it activated, strange things occurred. Plants died. Animals placed near it decayed rapidly. Some researchers reportedly aged years in a matter of hours. Walls and floors of the concrete chamber showed crystalline damage that couldn't be explained by radiation. It was as if the structure of time itself was unraveling inside that room. Witness accounts from former SS officers, declassified decades later, described sensations of distortion, of time stretching, folding, slowing. Men walked into the chamber and emerged minutes later, older, confused, disoriented. Some didn't emerge at all. The bell wasn't just a weapon, it was a portal, not to space, to time. The project was overseen by SS General Hans Kammler, a man already tied to Germany's most advanced wartime technologies. Rockets, jets, experiments in propulsion that bent the edge of plausibility. Kammler vanished in May 1945. So did the bell. When Allied forces stormed the Wenceslas site, they found only shadows, equipment removed, documents burned. But the physical evidence remained. Concrete scorched and altered at the molecular level, metal warped in ways that defied known physics. An absence so loud it echoed. Journalist Igor Witkowski uncovered buried documents in the 1990s. They described experiments in temporal displacement. A test subject exposed to the bell's maximum field emerged, appearing decades older, his body aged, but his memories intact, only for a few minutes of perceived time. Torsion fields, space-time manipulation, quantum fluctuations, words that had no place in 1940s physics, unless they weren't discoveries, unless they were remembered, recovered, reverse-engineered. Where had the knowledge come from? Some speculated that the Nazis had stumbled upon ancient relics or lost knowledge during their global expeditions. Others whispered that the bell had been built with blueprints not of this earth, or at least not of this time. Dr. Elizabeth Adler, a physicist on the project, vanished in 1946. Another scientist, Kurt Dewes, was brought to the US under Operation Paperclip. He never spoke of the bell. When pressed, he said only, "Some things should remain lost." The idea that the Nazis had succeeded in building a rudimentary time machine sounds like fantasy, but the signatures left behind, electromagnetic anomalies, unexplained materials, classified records, tell a quieter, stranger story. The bell was never recovered. Its blueprints never resurfaced. And yet, rumors persist of objects, people, even entire facilities that flicker into view and vanish again in forests once held by the Third Reich. As if the bell never stopped spinning, as if it's still running somewhere. And if it truly touched time, twisted it, bent it, then perhaps the past isn't as far behind us as we think. Perhaps it circles, lingers, waits, and maybe, just maybe, we haven't seen the last of the bell, only its beginning. New Mexico, 1947. The sky had been clear. Then the storm came. Flashes of lightning tore across the desert near Roswell, striking with a violence that rattled windows and nerves alike. Locals reported a deafening boom, something more than thunder, a presence in the air, as if the atmosphere itself had been wounded. The next day, the army announced the recovery of a flying disc. Hours later, they changed the story. A weather balloon. Case closed. But not for everyone. Inside the Roswell Army Airfield Hospital, behind secured doors and under the hush of military command, several nurses and medical staff witnessed something they would never forget. Miriam Bush, a secretary, came home shaken beyond words. To her family, she whispered only fragments, strange bodies, cold gray skin, oversized heads, and a silence that felt too deep. Her words were vague, but her fear was sharp. She never spoke of it again. Her silence became part of her identity. But others were more specific. Nurse Adeline Sparks, before her death in 1996, described assisting during a late-night medical examination. The body on the table was humanoid, but not human. The physiology was off, the bones too light, the skin like no texture she'd encountered. And the patient, because one had survived, was conscious, not with words, but with images. A small device, sleek and strange, projected visuals into the air, maps of stars, spirals of data, and something even more unexpected. Numbers, time codes, coordinates, temporal markers. The being hadn't just fallen from the sky, it had come from a different when. The message became clear. This wasn't an extraterrestrial encounter, it was a temporal one. The being had not intended to arrive in 1947. According to Sparks, it was a researcher from Earth's own future, part of a survey mission. A glitch in the navigation system, possibly caused by the electrical storm, had thrown them off course. They had come from a time centuries ahead where interstellar and temporal travel coexisted. Their mission was to study the past, not visit it by mistake. The injuries sustained in the crash were fatal. But before death, the being left behind clues, technologies decades ahead of anything known. Imaging tools capable of rendering Earth from orbit in real time. Medical devices that healed tissue through light and vibration. Tools that defied explanation in 1947. And DNA tests, classified, buried, revealed something haunting. The being was human, modified, engineered, adapted for environments far beyond Earth. But undeniably, one of us. This revelation caused panic behind closed doors. If the crash was real, and the being was from the future, then Earth's timeline had been breached. Accidentally or not, the implications were immense. So the story changed. A balloon, a misunderstanding, a lie repeated for decades. But the nurses who saw those bodies, who felt the presence of something both familiar and foreign, never forgot. Their testimonies survived in whispers, journals, and deathbed confessions. And they all agreed on one thing. Whatever crashed outside Roswell wasn't from another world. It was from another time. A time where humanity had changed, where history had looped back on itself. And the question they left us with is not, are we alone? But something deeper. What if our future is already watching us? And what happens if it accidentally leaves footprints in the past? Woolpit, England, August 1887. A quiet farming village nestled among the fields, where life moved with the steady rhythm of seasons. And then, two children appeared. They emerged from a hollow near the ancient wolf pits, silent, wide-eyed, and utterly foreign. Their skin was green, not ill, not bruised, green. Their clothing was strange, made of fabric no one recognized. Their language, a tangle of syllables, matched no known dialect, and they refused all food except for one thing: raw green beans. The villagers were baffled, but compassion overcame confusion. The children were taken in by the local landowner, Richard DeCalne, who tried to help them adapt. The boy grew weaker each day. Within weeks, he died. The girl survived. As her diet changed, her skin slowly lost its green hue. She began to learn English, haltingly, painfully. And eventually, she told her story. She and her brother had come from a land of perpetual twilight, a place without sun, where everything was dim and glowing. They'd been tending their family's animals when they heard a strange sound from a cave. Curiosity pulled them forward. And then, light, blinding, terrifying. When they stepped out of the cave, it was no longer twilight. It was Woolpit. She called her home St. Martin's Land, a place underground where everything was different. Buildings that reached into the rock above, lights that burned without fire, carriages that moved without horses. To the villagers, it sounded like fantasy. To modern ears, it sounds eerily like a future Earth. Her clothing, examined years later, was found to be of extraordinary construction, seamless, waterproof, resistant to stains. The weave too tight, too consistent, clearly machine-made in a way the 19th century could not replicate. And the language she once spoke, according to rare surviving fragments, bore structural similarities to English, but shifted, evolved, as if it had diverged from our present tongue centuries ago. The green pigmentation in her skin, once believed to be illness or fiction, has been reconsidered in light of modern biology. Not disease. Adaptation, possibly for low-light environments. Over time, the girl, later known as Agnes, assimilated into Woolpit life. She married, had children, grew old, but she never wavered from her story. She remembered the hum of machines buried beneath the earth, the artificial suns, the tunnels that connected distant places, the people who never saw the sky. What if she wasn't imagining? What if her twilight world wasn't myth? What if the Green Children were time travelers? Or more precisely, time refugees? If humanity were forced underground in some distant century by climate, catastrophe, or collapse, what would their descendants look like? What would they sound like? And what would happen if one day two of them wandered too far and fell into their own past? The Green Children of Woolpit are remembered now as folklore, but folklore often begins with something real, something inexplicable. And in the quiet fields of 19th century England, two children may have arrived too early from a world not yet born, a world that may still await us, beneath our feet, in the dark, still watching the light. Philadelphia, 1950. A train departed 30th Street Station bound for New York City. Ordinary in every way. 178 passengers, 12 crew members, a crisp schedule, a known route. It never arrived. More precisely, it arrived 25 years too late. The journey was uneventful, until it wasn't. As the train entered a tunnel near Trenton, passengers reported a strange pressure in their ears. Lights flickered, radios cut out, a low hum filled the cars, vibrating through metal and bone. Then, silence. When the train emerged on the other side, it was still nighttime. Still 10:47 p.m. But everything else had changed. The cars outside were different, sleek, unfamiliar. The signs bore company names no one recognized. The fashions, the language on advertisements, the colors of the station. This was not 1950. It was 1975. Confusion turned quickly to panic. A mother saw her child, now an adult, staring back at her from the platform. A man spotted his wife, grayed and older, weeping as she recognized him. The crew were detained immediately. Officials sealed off the station. The government took over within hours. The case was classified before morning. Records show that every name on the manifest matched a missing persons report filed in 1950. People who had vanished without a trace, whose families had mourned and moved on. Now they were back. But not really. They were lost in time, dislocated not just from history, but from life itself. Some passengers tried to restart. They found distant relatives, new homes, They aged alongside a world that had long outgrown them. Others couldn't cope. Several died within months, listed as natural causes, though their families believed otherwise. A few disappeared again. No records, no sightings, as if whatever force had taken them had come to finish what it started. The train itself was dismantled. Officials claimed it was outdated equipment, unfit for modern railways. But engineers noticed something odd. The metal had been altered, its molecular structure subtly changed, as if exposed to intense electromagnetic forces. Some components no longer functioned in ways physics could explain. The timestamps in the control systems showed a consistent 25-year gap, clock data that had never been tampered with. The conductor, James Hartley, never stopped asking questions. He spent his life researching time anomalies, electromagnetic fields, geological disruptions. Before his death, in 1993, he left behind a manuscript. In it, he suggested that the tunnel they entered had passed through a geological fault line, intersecting with a rare atmospheric condition, one that, under specific electromagnetic frequencies, could bend space-time. Not a machine, not a portal, a coincidence. A crack in the fabric of a time, opened just long enough for one train to pass through. The government denied everything. No such train, no such passengers, no such anomaly. But the death certificates issued in the 1970s tell a different story. Men and women who should have been 45 were buried at 70. People who should have lived entire lives were returned to a world where their stories had ended a generation ago. The Philadelphia train raises a chilling possibility. What if time isn't constant? What if, under rare and perfect conditions, it stutters? What if we're all moving forward until suddenly we're not? A tunnel, a hum, a flicker, and then you're gone. Not lost, just early. Montauk, New York. A cliffside military base, long abandoned, its rusting radar dish frozen like a sentinel staring into the Atlantic. Camp Hero. Officially decommissioned. Unofficially, it became the nucleus of one of the most disturbing timelines ever whispered about in the dark corners of American memory. From 1971 to 1983, something operated beneath the surface. Not metaphorically, physically. A vast underground facility, shielded, hidden, alive with energy. Witnesses called it the Montauk Project. Psychological conditioning, electromagnetic experimentation, time travel. But perhaps the most chilling accounts came from those who claimed they had been there as children. The Montauk boys. They say they were taken from homes, foster care, even schools, chosen for their sensitivity to certain frequencies, for latent psychic abilities they didn't understand, subjected to trials, machines, dreams that felt too real. One device above all stood out, the Montauk chair, a strange seat wired to consciousness itself. It read thoughts, amplified emotion, and, if you believed the stories, could bend reality. Duncan Cameron, a central figure in these testimonies, claimed he sat in the chair for hours, connected to machinery that transformed imagination into manifestation. He described visions, then experiences, then missions. Time travel, not as theory, but as lived memory. Ancient Egypt, Civil War America, even the distant future, the year 2749. He described cities floating on magnetic fields, technology indistinguishable from magic, disease eradicated, time travel regulated like air traffic. But it didn't last. Cameron, and others like him, began to unravel. Not psychologically, though many did, but temporally. They remembered things that hadn't happened yet, forgot people they hadn't met. Their bodies changed, aging too fast, or not at all. They called it temporal echo. When you exist in too many times at once, reality begins to fray. And then, in 1983, something broke. The chair was pushed too far, the subject too unstable. A rift opened, briefly, inside the base. Rooms began to shimmer between eras. Hallways shifted from pristine metal to decaying concrete and back again. Voices echoed that didn't belong. Some say a creature emerged, conjured by the fear of one test subject's subconscious. Whether metaphor or memory, the result was the same. The project shut down, sealed, silenced. The boys, now men, were scattered, sworn to secrecy. Some were subjected to memory suppression. Others, like Preston Nichols and Duncan Cameron, would recover fragments, slivers of impossible recollection, and begin to speak. Skeptics dismissed them. No documents, no footage, no proof. But the stories persisted. They aligned. Details matched. Descriptions of the underground facility were too consistent to ignore. Drawings of machinery echoed patents filed years later. Scientific terminology matched concepts still emerging in theoretical physics. Camp Hero remains closed to the public, but local residents report strange phenomena. Time slips, hours lost, lights in the sky. Sometimes people hiking near the base return confused, disoriented, their watches off by hours, their memories fogged. The Montauk project isn't about one story. It's about the possibility that somewhere, beneath concrete and sand, we reached through time and touched something we couldn't control. Not with a time machine, with the human mind itself. The question that lingers isn't whether it happened. It's whether we ever truly turned it off. Or if, somewhere beneath that rusting radar, the chair still waits, and time is still listening. 1998. A grainy video leaked into the shadows of the early internet. No fanfare, no press conference, just a silent upload, passed from hand to hand, burned onto discs, whispered about in forums where believers gathered in digital corners. It showed a being, slender, large-eyed, gray-skinned, seated in a dimly lit room, surrounded by humans, some in uniform, others in lab coats. It breathed heavily. Its eyes darted with emotion. Not fear, but exhaustion. The being was trying to speak. This wasn't a creature from another world. It was something stranger. It claimed to be human. Not just distantly related, not evolved from us, but us, from the year 2371. Its body, altered, adapted to a future Earth ravaged by catastrophe. Genetic engineering had shaped it for underground life, low light, sparse air. But its mind, its language, was unmistakably derived from ours. The man who released the footage called himself Victor, a pseudonym, a whistleblower, allegedly part of the facility where the footage had been recorded. He said the being had arrived through a failed temporal experiment, a mistake, a misfire. Not from the stars, but from a time that had tried to look back, and then got caught in its own reflection. The being described its mission: not conquest, not warning, observation. A program designed to study the past, to find moments, intervention points where slight nudges might steer humanity away from the path that led to their broken future. They were not supposed to be seen, but this one had been caught. When interrogators asked where it came from, it gave not a location in space, but one in time. Its coordinates, once decrypted, aligned with Earth's orbit in the late 24th century. It described our near future: a slow collapse, environmental ruin, War, genetic intervention becoming necessity, technology becoming survival. Not prophecy, history, its own. Linguists who studied the footage noted subtle shifts in grammar, how the being formed sentences, pronounced vowels, structured thoughts. Not alien, evolved. Like English, filtered through centuries of change. It spoke of data, predictive models, efforts to intervene gently, invisibly, a hand on the tiller of the past. But something had gone wrong. This being, cut off from its team, unable to return, died shortly after the interview. The cause was unclear. Exposure, stress, the atmosphere itself, its last message, barely audible, was chilling. The intervention failed. The path is locked. Victor, the man behind the leak, vanished from public view. The footage remains. An artifact, a mystery. Experts can't agree. Some say it's a hoax, an elaborate puppet, a digital creation ahead of its time. Others point to the physiological details, the breathing patterns, the eye movement, the reflections of light that no CGI in 1998 could replicate. But the deeper questions don't concern the footage. They concern the future it describes. A future not imagined, but lived. And the idea that right now we are living in the shadow of a timeline someone once tried to fix. We often ask if aliens have visited Earth. But what if the real visitors are our descendants? Not from another star, but from a future we are still building, with every decision, every delay, every denial. And what if the only warning we get is a face that looks back at us and sees what we became? July 2003. A man walks into a federal office in Toronto and quietly turns himself in. He has committed no violent crime. He carries no weapon. But what he has done is statistically impossible. Andrew Carlson. In just 2 weeks, he turned an $800 stock portfolio into $350 million. Every trade was flawless. Each market move predicted with uncanny precision. Not once did he lose. Not once did he hesitate. Wall Street analysts were stunned. The FBI opened an investigation. The SEC reviewed every record. They suspected insider trading of the highest order. But when asked to explain his trades, Carlson gave a different answer. He wasn't cheating. He was from the year 2256. At first, the agents laughed. Then they listened. Carlson calmly described a world centuries ahead, where the stock market's every move from the early 2000s had been studied, recorded, memorized. He simply came back with a list of events already known. Scandals, mergers, collapses. It wasn't magic, it was memory. The agents dismissed it, until he made predictions. No weapons of mass destruction would be found in Iraq, he said. Saddam Hussein would be captured on a precise date. A tsunami would strike the Indian Ocean in 2004, devastating entire nations. He named the countries, estimated the toll. Then he described technology, handheld glass devices that combined music, communication, and photography, social networks connecting billions through invisible signals, electric cars outselling gasoline within 2 decades. His descriptions weren't vague. They were technically sound, down to battery specifications, processor speeds, and touchscreen interfaces. Engineers present were quietly unnerved. This man wasn't guessing. He was describing blueprints that hadn't yet been drawn. Still, Carlson had no proof, no contacts, no documentation. He claimed he had come alone, that to reveal more would risk disrupting the timeline. Until, under pressure, he made one last offer. He would reveal the location of Osama bin Laden. Shortly after, his bail was posted, and Andrew Carlson disappeared. No court date, no trial. The man simply vanished. Investigators scoured his records. Nothing existed before 2002. His social security number belonged to a child who had died in the 1800s. His driver's license came from a DMV office that had been closed for years. His money? Transferred through accounts that led nowhere. The routing numbers matched no known bank. The final transfers went to institutions that didn't exist, at least not in our time. The trades themselves defied analysis. No algorithm could explain them. No pattern matched known financial models. It was as if he simply knew, without hesitation, what would happen next. The SEC closed the case in 2005. The official explanation: sophisticated fraud. But those who met Carlson spoke of something else. A man who didn't understand 2003 culture, who marveled at outdated phones and clunky laptops, who mispronounced brand names and asked naive questions about daily life. A man out of place, out of time. Carlson's story forces us to ask, if someone truly came back from the future, what would they do? Would they try to save lives? Or would they exploit their knowledge, knowing every move in advance? And if they vanished without a trace, leaving behind only accuracy, impossibility, and absence, how would we tell the difference between a hoax and history catching up with itself? Maybe the future has already visited, and maybe it doesn't want to be found. Roswell, Montauk, Woolpit. Each story threads through history like a strange chord vibrating beneath the noise of ordinary life. But one tale slips even further from the margins, into the forgotten corridors of academia. Liverpool, 1932. A city of coal smoke and clattering trams. At its university, a physicist named Dr. Robert Nelson was researching the effects of electromagnetic fields on human cognition. His work earned respect, funding, and eventually secrecy. What began as perception studies turned into something else, something that no one wanted to explain. The goal, publicly, was simple: explore how the brain processes time. But in the shadows of the lab, the experiments shifted. Electromagnetic pulses were calibrated, tuned with eerie precision. Participants reported moments of déjà vu, premonitions, time dilation, and then came the night of November 8th. Laboratory assistant Margaret Foster, working alone, activated the field generators for a standard calibration. That's when they arrived. Not from the hallway, not from the street, from thin air. Dozens of individuals, men and women in unfamiliar clothes, materialized in the lab. Their garments gleamed unnaturally. Their expressions were stunned but purposeful. They spoke English, but not quite. Their words danced between familiar cadence and foreign phrasing. One woman stepped forward. Dr. Sarah Chen. She said she was a physicist. From the year 2089. Their experiment in the future had coincided with Margaret's activation in the present. The two electromagnetic fields had harmonized, briefly tearing a hole through time. For 7 minutes, past and future shared the same room. Chen provided blueprints, drawn by hand, feverishly. Diagrams that outlined how to stabilize the field, how to prevent feedback loops, how to tune electromagnetic resonance for controlled temporal bridges. Then, one by one, the visitors faded, like light folding inward. Nelson, upon hearing the story and seeing the papers, acted swiftly. He confiscated Foster's notes. He dismantled the lab. He erased every trace. No publications, no letters, no records. The laboratory was demolished in 1934. Nelson transferred universities, never publishing again on temporal physics. He died in 1956, taking whatever he had learned into silence. But Foster never forgot. She kept the blueprints, hidden. After her death, they were recovered by her daughter and passed along to scientists. The analysis was clear. The diagrams showed an understanding of physics that wouldn't be discovered until at least the late 20th century. Magnetic containment principles, field harmonics, energy vectors, too advanced, too specific, too real. The University of Liverpool denies any record of the experiment. But history, like time, doesn't always follow paperwork. The questions remain. If a moment of resonance brought 2 points in time together, could it happen again? Is time not a river, but a web, where strands sometimes touch? And if someone from the future reached back just once and left behind a blueprint, would we even understand what we had been given? Or would we bury it? Not out of ignorance, but out of fear. Because to accept it would mean rethinking everything, not just where we are, but when we are, and who might be watching from the other side of the thread. They called him the man from nowhere. He arrived in Tokyo in the summer of 1954, stepping off a plane like any other businessman, calm, composed, and impeccably dressed. But within minutes, the illusion shattered. His passport was valid. Official seals, watermarks, signatures. It had passed inspection in other countries, but it bore the name of a nation no one had ever heard of. Tord. Located, he insisted, between France and Spain. He even had a map. But where the rest of the world saw Andorra, his document and his memory declared Torred. Not scribbled in, not altered, professionally printed. When questioned, he grew increasingly confused. This wasn't a forgery. This was a mismatch of realities. He had been to Japan before, he claimed, several times. He showed business cards from a company headquartered in Torred's capital, produced currency that didn't match any known European monetary system, showed a driver's license from his home country. Everything matched, except our world. The Japanese officials detained him, not out of suspicion, but confusion. He was polite, cooperative, but as they questioned him, inconsistencies multiplied. His colleagues remembered doing business with someone. Some said France, others said Andorra. No one could agree, as if memory itself had blurred around him. They placed him in a secure hotel room, locked, monitored. By morning, he was gone. No signs of escape, the door untouched, the window sealed. Cameras showed nothing. He had vanished without a trace. And when they went to retrieve the evidence, the passport, the currency, the IDs, they were gone too. Not stolen. Missing. Even photographs of the items were unreadable, blurred, distorted, as if reality refused to allow them to be captured. The only thing that remained were the written reports, the original testimonies of the customs agents who met him. Their memories consistent, their stories clear. A traveler from a country that did not and does not exist, but perhaps once did, or still does. Elsewhere, if our universe is not singular, but part of a multiverse, then maybe geography isn't fixed. Maybe history itself is unstable. Perhaps there are countless Earths, separated by infinitesimal divergences, timelines where wars ended differently, where borders were drawn by other hands, where languages evolved along different paths. And sometimes those paths cross, not permanently, just long enough for one man to arrive in the wrong world. We like to believe reality is consistent, that what we know today will still be true tomorrow, that maps are facts, not memories. But what if some travelers carry knowledge from places we can't reach? Not outer space, but adjacent time. The man from Taured remains an anomaly, a quiet riddle filed away in government cabinets. But his story invites a deeper question. How stable is the world we know? And if someone can slip in from a parallel version, can we slip out? Maybe déjà vu isn't a glitch. Maybe it's a memory of someplace we once were. And maybe, just maybe, we're all one decision away from waking up in a world that doesn't recognize us. Like the man from Taured, standing in an airport that should have welcomed him, but never existed at all. Time leaves traces, not always in clocks or calendars, but in the quiet seams of stories that refuse to fade. A train arriving 25 years too late. A woman on film, speaking into a device a century too early. Children from a land of twilight who forgot how to return. And the men and women who claim to have seen the future and then vanished before they could prove it. These stories, scattered across countries and centuries, share one haunting commonality: displacement. Each account is not about time travel in the cinematic sense. No lightning flashes, no glowing machines. Instead, they are quiet intrusions. A footstep where none should be. A conversation caught too early. A passport from a nation that never was. What do we make of them? Skeptics offer easy answers. Hoax, confusion, fraud. And sometimes that's all it is. But sometimes the impossibility itself feels deliberate, as if these moments are not accidents, but symptoms, evidence of something just beyond comprehension, a pattern we cannot quite see, but feel nonetheless. Perhaps time is not a straight line. Perhaps it loops, folds, breathes, and we, creatures who crave order, are simply trying to map a river with a ruler. For decades, physicists have wrestled with the concept of temporal mechanics. Wormholes, closed time-like curves, quantum superpositions. They tell us that time may not be what we think it is. It may be porous. It may be responsive. It may be watching us. What if memory itself is an artifact of temporal fluidity? What if those strange intuitions, the sense you've lived a moment before or met someone you've never known, are echoes, ripples from adjacent timelines? What if the people we call lost, missing persons, unexplained vanishings, aren't gone, just elsewhere? And what if the future is not fixed? What if it's visiting us, quietly, trying to understand where it came from and how to keep from returning to the ruin it remembers? Throughout this journey, one theme has echoed again and again. They came back too early. Not to warn, not to change, but perhaps to witness, to learn, or maybe even to mourn. Because every traveler from tomorrow carries a burden, the knowledge of what we have yet to become. And in their presence, we are faced with a mirror not of who we are, but who we might be. The question is no longer, is time travel possible? It's, would we even notice if it already happened? Maybe we wouldn't. Maybe we didn't. But if time can be walked, if the past can be visited, then we are not alone in our moment. We are one point on a thread stretching endlessly in both directions. And somewhere, out there, or in here, someone is watching us with eyes from a century yet to come. Not with judgment, but with hope, because the timeline is still being written, and the future, perhaps, is holding its breath, waiting to see what we choose next.